Dmai Pargvov Mishnah Aleph. Hamakabel Sodom Yisrael Min Ha'ovid Kechavim Min Hakusi. The Mishnah teaches the chiyuv of meiser for somebody who farms the field as a sharecropper or as a tenant farmer. A sharecropper is an oris, is someone who rents land to farm and agrees to pay the owner a percentage of the crop. A choicher, a tenant farmer, also rents the land to farm, but instead of paying a percentage of the crop, he agrees to pay the owner a fixed amount of produce. A sharecropper typically pays the owner a half, a third, or a quarter of the crop, depending on various factors, and he keeps the rest for himself. So, Amakabel Sodom Yisrael Min Ha'ovid Kechavim Min Hakusi, someone who receives a field as a sharecropper from a yid, or even from a goy or a kusi. So kusim, we mentioned who they were in the previous parak. So Yechalek Lefnei may divide the produce in front of them, which means he could give the landowner his share of the crop without first separating truma and meiser from it. The Chachamim were mekel with sharecroppers to ensure that Eretz Yisrael would remain cultivated. The Chachamim generally assered releasing tevel from one's possession without taking off meiser first. Therefore, it's forbidden to sell tevel, as we mentioned in the previous parak, or to send it as a gift, as we mentioned in parak Gimel. They made an exception in the case of sharecroppers and allowed them to give the landowner his share of the crop without taking off meiser first. They were concerned that if the sharecroppers were required to take off meiser of the crop before giving it to the landowner, his share, it might discourage people from leasing the fields as orises, as a sharecropper. This in turn might leave much of the farmland of Eretz Yisrael uncultivated. So to prevent this, the Chachamim were matir that sharecroppers could give the landowner his share in tevel, and it's not an issue. So Hachoicher Sodom Yisrael, somebody who rents a field as a tenant farmer from a yid, Terim v'noisalei, he must separate truma from the crop and only give the landowner his share. He is not required to separate any other meises before giving the owner his share. So the law of somebody who tenant farms a field of a goy will be discussed in the next Mishnah. So truma is supposed to be separate from the crop while it's still on the threshing floor, as we mentioned many times. Since the contract of a tenant farmer requires him to give the landowner his share after the crop has already been removed from the threshing floor, the Chachamim left the chiyuv to separate truma from the crop with the choicher. However, sharecroppers commonly set aside the owner's share before removing it from the threshing floor and leave it for him there. So the Chachamim therefore did not require the oris to separate truma for the balabayas. The choicher is responsible only to separate truma. The cost of the truma, however, falls on the landowner. The choicher therefore subtracts the amount he separated as truma from the amount he pays the balabayas, the owner of the field. The chachamim were not mechayev a tenant to separate other meisers. For the same reason, they didn't require a sharecropper to do so, and that is to make sure that Eretz Yisrael would be cultivated. Rabbi Yisrael. Rabbi Yehuda said, Emasai. When do we say that a tenant farmer, that a choicher, does not need to separate other meises? When he gave the landowner his share from the produce of the same field that he rented and from the same species of produce that they agreed he would plant. A tenant farmer pays the landowner a fixed amount of produce, not a percentage of the crop. It therefore does not have to be from the produce of that field. But if he gave him his share from the produce of a different field, even though it's from the same species, or he gave him produce from a different species, even though it's from the field that he rented, they agreed he would plant wheat on the field, but he planted barley on part of the same field, and the landowner agreed to take it as payment. So he must separate all of the meiser and give the landowner his share. The landowner agrees to accept tevel as his share only when the tenant farmer, the choicher, grew that kind of produce he originally agreed to plant. In this case, the tenant farmer, the choicher, must separate not only truma but all the meisers. Furthermore, it is he who must bear the cost of the meisers. He therefore must give the landowner his full share in the meiser produce and may not subtract the amount of meiser from the landowner's total. Mishnah Beis. HaChoicher Sadam and Evik. The end of the previous Mishnah taught the halacha of a choicher who rents from a field from a yid. The Mishnah now explains the law, the halacha for a tenant farmer, a choicher who rents a field from a goy. So HaChoicher Sadam and Evik, someone rents a field as a tenant farmer from a goy, Ma'asav and Naisin must first separate all the meiser and give the landowner his share, meaning he must separate both truma and meiser from the landowner's share of the crop before giving it to him. In this case, the tenant farmer bears the cost of the meiser of the entire crop, and he must pay the landowner his full fee in meiser. So the Chachamim placed this penalty on him in order to discourage people from renting land in Eretz Yisrael from goyim, and therefore pressure the goyim to sell the land to a yid. The Chachamim wished to discourage the ownership of land in Eretz Yisrael by goyim. Therefore, they instituted this rule to make it more attractive for the goy to sell his land to a yid than to keep it and rent it. By placing the burden and cost of separating all the meises on the choicher, they created a situation in which people would be reluctant to rent farms from goyim. And this would be in turn be the cause that the land that would be owned by Ovdei Avodah Zarah and Eretz Yisrael, by goyim and Eretz Yisrael, to remain unused, and force them to sell it to Yidden at a very affordable price. The Rabbanim were not mechayev this penalty, this einish on sharecroppers, because the landowners were not looking for sharecroppers, but for tenant farmers. Tenant farming was more profitable for them, since it guaranteed them a fixed amount of produce, unlike sharecropping, where the size of the landowner share depended on the success of the crop. So therefore, a landowner who could not find a tenant farmer to lease his field would be more inclined to sell it than to lease it to a sharecropper. Rabbi Yehuda says, someone receives his ancestor's field as a sharecropper from a guy. He rents a field that originally belonged to his family but was stolen by goyim, let's say like Sikrikin, like the Mishnah says in Gittin. He must separate all the meiser and only then give the landowner his share. In this case, the Chachamim were geyser that even a sharecropper is required to separate all the meiser in order to encourage him to buy back his family's field from the guy. Since the field originally belonged to the sharecropper's family, it is therefore precious to him, and he'll rent it from the guy even though he must pay for all the meisers. However, when this eventually becomes too expensive for him, he'll strain himself to find the money to buy it. The Chachamim were therefore mechayev him to take off meiser from the entire crop as a way of pushing him to buy the field back from the guy. It's the sugi there in Gittin on Daf, in Hanazakon by the Mishnah of Sekrikim. Mishnah Gimel. Kayin v'levi shekiblu sadam Yisrael. We learned in Mishnah Aleph that a sharecropper may give the landowner his share without giving off meiser. The Mishnah discusses whether a sharecropper is a kayin or a levi has the right to take for himself the truma or meiser from the balabayas, or whether the balabayas has the right to give it to any kayin or levi that he chooses. So kayin v'levi shekiblu sadam Yisrael. If a kayin or a levi received a field as a sharecropper from a yid, from Yisrael, kashem shechalkum achulun kachalkum atruma. The halacha is that just as the sharecropper and the landowner divide the crops chulin, which is the stuff that was already masukin, meiser was already taken off from, so too do they divide the crops truma and meiser. That is, when the landowner takes his percentage of the crop, included in it is the truma and meiser that must be separated from it. The landowner then separates the meisers for himself and gives them to the kohen and levi of his choice. For example, if they agreed that the landowner received a third of the crop, it's entitled to receive a third of the truma and meiser that will be separated from the crop to give to the kohen and the levi of his choice. In other words, he takes his third of the crop without meiser. He takes off meiser and gives the truma and meiser to any kohen and levi he wants. Of course, the kohen and levi sharecropper can take the 2/3 of his produce and keep the truma or meiser for himself. The kohen of the levi sharecropper has no special right to it. Rabbi Lezer says that the meisers also belong to the sharecroppers. So a kohen sharecropper receives the truma of the entire crop, and a levi sharecropper receives the meiser of the entire crop, because it was on this condition that they came to lease the field. There was an understanding that the kohen and levi agreed to work the landowner's field only on condition that the truma or meiser would go exclusively to them. A kohen sharecropper separates truma from the entire crop and takes it for himself, and then divides the remainder of the produce into the agreed percentage and gives the landowner his share. A levi sharecropper would do the same with regard to meiser. So the first Tana agrees that this was the understanding. Nevertheless, he doesn't consider it binding because no kinyan was made to transfer this right to the kohen or levi, and there's a big discussion about this in Yerushalmi as well. Mishnah Dalet. Yisrael shekibel mikohen milevi hamashas l'baylam. The Mishnah continues the discussion, and it considers the opposite case: a Yisrael who leases the field as a sharecropper from a kohen or a levi. Yisrael shekibel mikohen milevi. A Yisrael receives a field as a sharecropper from a kohen or levi. Hamashas l'baylam. The meiser belongs to the landowner because it's assumed that he meant to keep the right for himself to take off meiser. So even the Tana Kama, the previous Mishnah, who said that a kohen or levi sharecropper is not kohen the rights to the meisers from Yisrael, who owns the land, he agrees with our Mishnah's ruling that a kohen or levi landowner keeps the rights to the truma or meiser when he rents a field to Yisrael sharecropper. Since the field was his to begin with, he does not have to make a kinyan to acquire the rights to them. He needs only to avoid giving them away. For this reason, the lease agreement is understood to mean that the entire field is being leased to the sharecropper, except for the place where the truma and meiser will grow. The truma or meiser that is later separated therefore belongs to the landowner, and the rest of the crop is divided according to the percentages that were agreed upon. So if the landowner is a kohen, all the truma goes to him, and all the rest of the produce is divided between the landowner and the sharecropper, who may give his share of the meiser to the levi of his choice. If the landowner is a levi, all the meiser goes to him, and the remainder of the produce, including a share of the truma, is divided between the landowner and the sharecropper, who may give his share of the truma to the kohen of his choice. Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Hakatani Shekibel Sadam Yerushalmi. A villager, someone who lives outside Yerushalayim, who receives a field as a sharecropper from someone who lives in Yerushalayim. So until now, the Mishnah was discussing the division of Truma, which is given to the Kohen and Meiser Rishon. The Mishnah is now going to have a machlekes about Meiser Sheni, which might be brought to Yerushalayim and eaten there. So why is this person called a kartani, a villager? The villager here refers to anybody who's living outside Yerushalayim, where Meiser Sheni was not eaten. So halacha applies even to people who live in larger towns and cities. The Mishnah speaks of a villager only because it was common for villagers to work as sharecroppers in fields owned by city dwellers, such as people even in Yerushalayim. So Meiser Sheni shall Yerushalmi. If the Meiser Sheni belongs to the Yerushalmi, it's assumed that the villager gives up his rights to the Meiser Sheni to the landowner because he does not want the burden of bringing it to Yerushalayim to eat it there. The villager himself is able to go up and eat the Meiser Sheni in Yerushalayim since he can travel to Yerushalayim at any time. There's no reason to assume that he gives up his share of Meiser Sheni. Therefore, the Meiser Sheni too is divided between the landowner and the sharecropper. Unlike Truma and Meiser, which Yisrael cannot keep and must give the Kohen Levi, Meiser Sheni is something that a villager can benefit from by bringing it to Yerushalayim. I mean, it's not dependent on if he's a Kohen Levi or Yisrael. It depends on the ownership, and then he can just bring that. He can bring that up to Yerushalayim and eat it there. So there's no reason to assume that the lease agreement with the Yerushalmi includes a provision for the Yerushalmi to keep all the Meiser Sheni. Mishnah Hey. If someone receives olive trees as a sharecropper to produce oil, meaning he receives trees that are full of olives under a sharecropping agreement that requires him to pick the olives, press them into oil, then divide the oil with the owner. So, the halacha is that just as they divide the chulin, meaning the dvar masukanim, a portion of oil between them, so too they divide the truma and meiser portion of oil between them. In this case, it makes no difference whether the sharecropper is Yisrael leasing from a Kohen or Levi, or a Kohen or Levi leasing from Yisrael. Either way, they share the truma or meiser just as they share the rest of the oil. We learned in the previous Mishnah that when Yisrael sharecropper leases a field from a Kohen or Levi, the owner keeps all the truma or meiser, as was explained there. The reason he does so is that he excludes from the agreement the right to the part of the land which these meisers will grow, and holds it for himself. Here, however, it is not the use of the land or trees that's being leased, but the right to harvest the olives and make them into oil. So there's not even going to be a shayla over here about davar shelo b'lo olam, because it seems that the olives are here already. Here, however, it's not the use of the land or trees that's being leased, but the right to the harvest the olives and make them into oil. Holding back from the leased part of the land or trees is of no use to the owner in this case, since the land is not being leased. It's fully grown olives that are being leased. So the landowner therefore has no more right to the meisers from this oil than the sharecropper, and they divide the meisers the same as they do to the oil. This is certainly true where a Kohen or a Levi sharecropper leases from Yisrael landowner, where the Tanakama, which was mentioned in Mishnah Gimel, says that they divide the meisers even in the case of leasing of the land. Rabbi Yehuda says, Yisrael shekibul mikoyin milevi zeisim l'shemen. If Yisrael accepts olive trees as a sharecropper from a Kohen or a Levi to produce oil from them, l'mach tischar, or where he partners with a Kohen or Levi to sell his oil for half the profits, ha-meiser l'baylim. All the meiser belong to the Kohen or Levi. The Rav understands that oil l'mach tischar is it's not Yisrael shekibul mikoyin milevi zeisim l'shemen l'mach tischar, but he adds a word over here, oil l'mach tischar, or for half the profits. This is how the Yerushalmi also has the girsa. This case does not refer to a sharecropping agreement, but to a business venture where the owner of the trees that's full of olives enters into agreement with the merchant to sell the oil they'll produce, with each partner receives half of the profits from the sales. All the meiser belongs to the owner, the Kohen or the Levi. Rabbi Yehuda considers leasing olive trees to produce oil to be the same as leasing land to farm, because the olives are still attached to the tree. Therefore, just as someone who leases land as a sharecropper from a Kohen or Levi must give truma or meiser from the crop to the owner, as the previous Mishnah taught, so too someone who leases olive trees to make oil, or who sells someone else's oil to share in this profit, must give the truma or meiser to the owner. Rabbi Yehuda says this is only in a case where Yisrael leases from a Kohen or Levi. He agrees that in the opposite case, where a Kohen or Levi leases from Yisrael, that the sharecropper has no right to all the meisers, as the Tanakama mentioned in Mishnah Gimel. Okay, let's continue on to Mishnah Vav. Having mentioned in the previous Mishnah that there was a arrangement of a sharecropper to produce oil from olives, so our Mishnah is going to talk about a machlekes about selling olives. So a person may not sell his olives except to a chaver. Someone who's careful about hilchos tumah v'tara. Someone who's not a chaver is assumed to be tameh. So if olives are sold to him, he'll make them tameh when he begins to press the oil from them, and it's forbidden to cause tumah to tevel. The Mishnah speaks of olives that have already been harvested but not yet gemaisha. The olives cannot become tameh as they are, because the Mishnah speaks of a case where they have not yet become huksher l'kabel tumah. To become prepared for tumah, an olive, like any other food, must become wet with one of the 7 liquids after it has already been picked. One of these liquids happens to be olive oil. When the olives begin to ooze oil at the start of the pressing process, when they're packed together in a vat to soften, they become prepared for tumah. They become huksher l'kabel tumah. Since someone who's not a chaver is assumed to be tameh, when he touches them at that point, they will become tameh. But it's forbidden to cause tevel to become tameh because the truma contained in it will become tameh. For this reason, Beis Shammai ruled that the olives may be sold only to a chaver who will be careful not to make them tameh. Beis Hillel say, Af l'maiser, a person may sell his olives even if the someone was careful about maiser, even though he's not a chaver in terms of tumah v'tara, since the olives are still dry at the time when he sells them and they cannot become tameh. It's possible that the buyer will eat them before they ever became muksher to be makabel tumah, and it would be permissible to sell them. However, the modest ones of Beis Hillel, those that were extremely careful about keeping mitzvahs, conducted themselves according to the opinion of Beis Shammai in this matter, and they sold their olives only to chaver. It's interesting because although most olives are bought to make oil and not to eat, the mere possibility that they will be used in a permissible manner is enough to be matir the sale. However, the buyer must at least be trusted to take ma'aser of his produce properly, because it's prohibited to sell tevel produce to somebody who might not take off ma'aser properly. Mishnah Zayin. Shnaim shabatzros kamein l'seich gas achas. If 2 partners pick the grapes from the vineyard and place them into a single winepress, both vineyards are owned in partnership, and the partners do not divide their shares after the harvest, but place all the grapes in the same winepress to make wine from them. Thus, the wine that is produced is now owned equally by both, and they now wish to divide the wine that they share in this partnership. So one of the partners does take off meiser, and the other partner does not take off meiser. He's an Amaretz. So the halacha is like this: the one who's makbid to take off meiser has to take off meiser from half the wine that belongs to him because it's v'adai tevel. And additionally, he must take off half of his partner's share of the wine wherever it is. Thus, he must take off meiser on 3/4 of the wine. When the partners own a property jointly, they're each viewed as owning a piece of each part of it. Meaning, it's not that he owns half and he owns half. Every part of it is owned half and half. So in the case of grapes, for example, each partner owns half of each grape and half of every drop of wine made from these grapes. Thus, when they divide the wine, exactly half of what each partner receives was originally owned by the other one, and they're exchanging shares. In effect, each one says to the other, you take one share and keep the half of it that's really mine, and in exchange for letting me take the other share and keeping the half of it that is really yours. This exchange is considered to be the same as a sale. Since it's forbidden to sell tevel, the partner is careful about meiser, must make sure at the time that they divide the wine that he takes off meiser, not only the part that he ends up keeping for himself, which is half the wine, but also half of what the other partner receives, which he in effect sold to him, and he must therefore meiser 3/4 of the wine. Mishnah Ches. Shnaim shekiblu sada ba'arisus. If 2 people receive the field together in a sharecropping arrangement, oishe yarshu, or they inherited the field together, oishe nishtatu, they became partners in the field, which means that they bought it together. One of them is careful about ma'aser, while the other one is an Amaretz. So Yachal Ulaymar, when they come to divide the produce, the one who is careful may say to the Amaretz, Tailat chitim shabamakom plain. If any chitim shabamakom plain, you take the wheat that's in such and such a place in the field, and I'll take the wheat that's in such and such a place or a different part of the field. Ata yayin shabamakom plain, Yavanisha yayin shabamakom plain. Or you take the wine that's in such and such a place, and I'll take the wine that's in this specific place, a different place. Since each partner takes his share of the produce from a different part of the field, they're not considered to be selling their shares to each other, which would be forbidden, as we mentioned in the previous Mishnah. Rather, they're determining which part of the crop belongs to each one of them from the very beginning. This is based on a concept called brera, retroactive clarification, which says that a determination made at a later time can clarify the legal status, the halachic legal status, of something at an earlier time when the status was actually unclear. This takes effect retroactively, which means that once the determination is made, we view the status as having been that way all along. This principle is the subject of Machlekes Tanoim. Our Tana relies on it to determine the ownership of the produce back to the time when they first took over the field. This does not contradict what we learned in the previous Mishnah. There, the Mishnah spoke of grapes that had already been harvested, while our Mishnah speaks about dividing wheat and grapes that have not yet been cut and are still attached to the ground. According to the Tana of our Mishnah, when partners divide a crop while it's still attached to the ground, based on which part of the field that it grew in, it makes sense to say that the division determines retroactively who owned which part of the crop from the beginning, because it clarifies which part of the land belonged to each one from the beginning, and it's normal to divide the land in this way. However, once the wheat or grapes have been cut and no longer have any connection to the ground, the division of the cut produce cannot show us retroactively who owned which part of the land, and the most it can do is show us retroactively which individual stalks of wheat or clusters of grapes that grew together were owned from the very beginning by which partner. The Tana of our Mishnah does not allow the use of bearer to this extent to avoid the problem of exchanging the shares. Okay. So the partner who is careful to take off Meiser therefore needs to separate Meiser only from his portion of the wheat or the wine, not from his partner's share. But he may not say to him, you take the wheat and I'll take the barley, or you take the wine and I'll take the oil. When each one agrees to take a different type of produce for himself, it is always considered a sale, and it's going to be considered forbidden to sell tevel. Even if the produce is still attached to the ground, if one partner receives his share from one type of grain and the other from a different type, the transfer would be treated as an exchange of shares, which is a form of selling tevel. For example, if they jointly planted wheat and barley, each partner has the rights to both the wheat and the barley. If they now decide that one will take all the wheat and the other all the barley, brera cannot be used to determine that one partner originally had only wheat and the other had only barley. Thus, the division is by necessity a trade of one partner's share of wheat for the other one's share of barley. Mishnah Tes. If two brothers, one who's a chaver, who's careful about Tum V'Tara and is careful about Meiser, and the other's an Amaretz, Sheyarshu Saviyam Amaretz, they inherited their father's property, who was an Amaretz. So any produce that he left is assumed to be Demai and Tameh. So Yachlu Leimalai, when it comes to divide the inheritance, the chaver may say to his brother, the Amaretz, Tailat Zechitim Shevmakum Pleni, Vanichitim Shevmakum Pleni. You can take the wheat that's in such and such a place in the field, and I'll take the wheat that's in a different place in the field. You can take the wine in such and such a place, and I'll take the wine in a different place, as we learned in the previous Mishnah. Here too, the Mishnah speaks of a case where the wheat and grapes are still attached to the ground. Therefore, when they divide the produce according to the part of the field of the vineyard in which it was growing, the chaver does not have to take meiser from his brother's share. Nor is there any concern about the produce being tameh, since produce that's still attached to the ground cannot become tameh. But he has to be careful not to tell him, you take the wheat and I'll take the barley. You take the moist produce, which may be tameh, and I'll take the dry produce, which is certainly not tameh. As we learned in the previous Mishnah, that exchanging two different types of produce for each other is always considered a sale. This case of the Mishnah is referring to produce which was harvested, so now it could become tameh. However, before it can become tameh, it must first become mukhshal kabel tumah by being made wet with one of the 7 liquids that are mixture of food for tumah, which would be dew, water, wine, olive oil, blood, milk, or honey. So dry produce that has not yet become in contact with one of these liquids, is not able to become tameh. Since the original owner of the produce, in this case the father, was not ma'aretz, any wet produce that he left as inheritance must be assumed to be tameh, and would therefore be beneficial for the chaver, who is careful to only eat things that are tahar, to take for himself only the dry produce that he knows would be tahar, and leave the wet produce, which is assumed to be tameh, for his brother, who is the am haaretz. So, just like we said before, that exchanging two different types of produce is considered a sale, wet and dry produce also are considered different varieties and would be considered a sale in this case as well. Since it's forbidden for a chaver to sell to an am haaretz either demai or produce that can become tameh, he cannot divide the inheritance with his am haaretz brother in this manner. The reasons for this were explained previously. Although the father's produce is assumed to be tameh, since he too is an am haaretz, it's not definitely tameh. Therefore, it's forbidden to give it to another am haaretz who might make it tameh if it wasn't already tameh from before. Okay. Mishnah Yud. Ger v'avik kachavim sheyarsh v'saviyam avik kachavim. The Mishnah is going to talk about another halacha of two people dividing their inheritance, this time involving avodah zarah stuff. A yid is forbidden. There's halacha that it's asur to receive any hana from avodah zarah. If he exchanges an idol for money or some other object, that item becomes asur b'hana, just like the avodah zarah itself. So the same rule applies to yayin nesach, which is wine that has been poured in front of avodah zarah. It's also midiraisa to be nana from such wine, and whatever a person receives in exchange for it is similarly forbidden to bahana. This can create a problem for a ger who inherits property from his father along with his non-Jewish brother who's still an Oved Avodah Zarah. So the Mishnah teaches how he may divide the estate which contains forbidden items with his brother. So ger v'Oved Kacham she'yorsh v'savim goy, if a convert to Judaism and his brother who still does Avodah Zarah inherited the property of the father who is an Oved Avodah Zarah, who is a goy, so Yachulu Loimar, he's able to tell him when they're dividing up the inheritance, you take the avodah zarah and I'll take the money. Ata yayin va'ani peris. You take the yayin nesach and I'll take the produce that's mutter. Although items received in exchange for avodah zarah or nesach wine are normally forbidden for benefit, in this case the money or produce received by the ger in exchange for a share of the avodah zarah and the yayin nesach is mutter. Since the ger does not inherit his non-Jewish father midiraisa, he doesn't really own a share of this idols and wine. Midiraisa, if someone becomes a ger, he's gekatan shenela dami, and he's not legally related to his birth parents. For this reason, a ger cannot inherit his natural father midiraisa, since he's no longer halachically his son. The Chachamim, however, decreed that a ger does inherit his father, so he should not be tempted to go back to avodah zarah in order to be able to receive his father's money. For this reason, the item he receives and places them cannot be considered as having come to him in exchange for them. Normally, the brothers who inherit their father become equal partners in every item in the estate from the moment he dies. Had that been the case here, the convert, the ger, would be forbidden to take other items in exchange for the avodah zarah or the yayin nesach. A ger, however, does not inherit his father midiraisa. Thus, when he offers the avodah zarah to his brothers, he's not trading avodah zarah for money because the avodah zarah is not his to trade. He's simply assigning them to his brother as a brother's share of the inheritance of the Yerusha. Since the money he receives has not come to him in exchange for the avodah zarah, it's mutar b'hana. Although the Chachamim were geyser that a ger receives a share of his father's inheritance, they did so only for items that are permitted to him for benefit, and not for avodah zarah and yayin nesach that's also b'hana. Therefore, even after the Rabbanim made their takana, they made their gzeira, he owns no actual share in them. However, once the avodah zarah or the yayin nesach came into the ger's physical possession, which means he received them as part of his share and took possession of them, he halachically owns them, and therefore osir. It's forbidden for him to exchange them for money or produce, and if he does so, they become osir b'hana. Mishnah Yud Aleph. Hamaycha Peris b'Surya. The Mishnah is going to turn to a new topic in Amaretz who sells produce in Surya. Surya is in the land of Aram Naraim, Aram Tseva, that were conquered and annexed to Eretz Yisrael by David HaMelech, which is probably Syria today. In some ways, Surya is treated like Eretz Yisrael, in other ways it's treated like Chutz La'aretz. Since David HaMelech conquered Surya before he conquered all of Eretz Yisrael, it did not acquire the Kedushas Ha'aretz. This is learned out from a pasuk. However, the Chachamim were geyser that Surya should have the same halachas as Eretz Yisrael for certain halachas. So produce grown in Jewish-owned land in Surya is mechuyev in Truma and Ma'aser Mid'Rabbanan. The Mishnah is now going to discuss how Dmai works over there. So Amaycha Peres b'Surya, Amaretz sells produce in Surya. V'Omar Mishal Eretz Yisrael Hein, he says it's from Eretz Yisrael. Chayv la'aser, the person who's buying is mechuyev to take off Ma'aser. Produce from Eretz Yisrael is subject to the halachas of Ma'aser, even if it's brought to another country. Since the Amaretz says that this produce came from Eretz Yisrael, the buyer must treat it as Dmai and separate Ma'aser properly. By saying that these pears came from Eretz Yisrael, the seller is saying that it's mechuyev for Ma'aser. Since he's Amaretz, we can't assume that Ma'aser was taken off of. Therefore, it must be taken off Ma'aser as Dmai. However, had the seller not mentioned that the produce came from Eretz Yisrael, the buyer would not have been required to take off Ma'aser. This is because most of the produce sold in Surya was not grown in Eretz Yisrael or Surya, but came from outside the land. These places were not included in the decree of Dmai, so a person buying produce in Surya may normally assume that Ma'aser does not need to be taken off. Mi'usar and Hain. But if the Am Haaretz added that the produce has already been Gemaiser, now when he's believed, and the buyer doesn't need to take off Meiser. Why is that? Shapesha Asar hu Pesha Hitter. Because the mouth that answered the produce is the same as the mouth that permitted it. That means that just as we believe that Am Haaretz the Asar produce that which would require it to be Mechuyev and Meiser by saying that it came from Eretz Yisrael, so too we must believe him to be Matir, the same produce, to pater it from Meiser by saying that he had already taken off Meiser. Although Am Haaretz is usually not believed when he claims that his produce is Gemeiser, that's because his word is not enough to remove a Vadai obligation to take off Meiser. But in this case, the obligation to take off Meiser took effect only because of his statement that the produce came from Eretz Yisrael. Had he claimed that it came from outside Eretz Yisrael, or he hadn't said anything at all, it would have been treated like any other produce sold in Syria, which does not have to have Meiser taken off of to begin with. Therefore, since the only way we knew that this produce is subject to Meiser l'chatchila altogether is because this Am Haaretz told us so, so we must also believe his word that he removed the chiyuv of Meiser by taking Meiser off it already. Mishali Hain, if the Am Haaretz says his produce is from my own field in Syria, Chayv la'aser, the buyer is mechuyev to take off Meiser, since the produce grown in Syria is also mechuyev in Demai, and it probably grew there as well. Musar and Hain. But if the Am Haaretz as the produce has already been gemaiser, now when he's believed Shapesh Asar or Pesha Hitir, because the mouth that answered the produce by saying that it came from his field is the same as the mouth that was matir by saying that it had already been gemaiser. However, if it is known to this that the seller has at least one field in Syria, the buyer is obligated to take off meiser when the produce as Demai, even if the seller didn't say that it came from the field. Since we know that he owns a field in Syria, we must assume that the produce he is selling comes from that field. Thus, we assume that it's mechuyev in meiser, even without him saying so. So we therefore have no basis to believe him that he took meiser of this produce, since it was not a pesha asar or pesha hitir. Because over here you have to take off meiser regardless of what he says. There's no basis to believe the pesha hitir, because we're not being samech on the pesha asar to begin with, because we know that he owns the field already. So that's where the chiyuv is coming from, not because of the pesha asar that we're allowing him to say over here. Mishnah Yud Beis. Am Haaretz Amar L'Chaver. If Am Haaretz said to a chaver in the marketplace, Kach li gudas yarek, buy me a bundle of vegetables. Kach li gluskan echad, buy me a small loaf of bread. Since the chaver did not specify at the time of the purchase which of the items was for himself, which was for the Am Haaretz, he can use the principle of breira to determine retroactively that the one he gives the Am Haaretz is the one that he bought for him. This case cannot be compared to the case in Mishnah Zayin previously, which we did not apply the halacha of breira to determine that the share of wine taken by the Am Haaretz partner was always his. In that case, there were partners in the grapes before it was made into wine, and the concept of breira cannot be used to separate their shares for the reason explained there. Here, however, the chaver and the Am Haaretz were never partners in the vegetables or loaf of bread. It's just that the chaver did not specify at the time of the purchase which one was for whom. So we may therefore apply breira and say that the bundle or loaf that the Am Haaretz received is always his. So like stam upata, the chaver may buy two bundles or two loaves of Dmai without specifying which one's for himself, which one's for the Am Haaretz, and he's part from taking off meiser from the one that he gave to the Am Haaretz. So when he later gives to the Am Haaretz, is assumed to be the one that he bought for himself. Since it never belonged to the chaver, he's under no obligation to take meiser of it before delivering it to the Am Haaretz. Since Vim Amar Shali Zev Shel Chaveri. However, if the chaver said when he made the purchase, this bundle or loaf is mine, and this one's for my friend, then it's arvu, and then they got mixed up, so one doesn't know which bundle or loaf belongs to him, which one belongs to the Am Haaretz. Chayv la'as that a chaver is obligated to take off meiser not only on the bundle or the loaf he takes for himself, but also the one he gives to the Am Haaretz, since the ownership of the items was originally fixed. Separating the mixture later on cannot determine that each one is receiving the one that was originally his. Because breira can be used only to determine the status of something that had never been determined. It cannot be used to discover the identity of something known that became mixed up with the other items. So breira can tell us that the bundle that the Am Haaretz receives is always his, only when the chaver never identified which one belonged to him. But where he specified the ownership of the bundles, and they then became mixed up, breira cannot say that the bundle the Am Haaretz receives from the mixture is the one that was specified previously, since perhaps it wasn't. The chaver must therefore take off meiser from the bundle he gives to the Am Haaretz, so it's actually his bundle. He will not be over on transferring his Demai to the Am Haaretz. Vafilu hein meya, he must do so even if there were as many as 100 bundles that he bought for the Am Haaretz and only a single bundle for himself. Although his bundles outnumbered 100 to 1 in the mixture, he cannot assume that all 100 bundles he gives to the Am Haaretz are those that he bought for him. Therefore, he must take off Meiser on one of those out of 100 bundles before giving them to the Am Haaretz. And we don't say that his bundle comes Batul Barayiv in the Am Haaretz's bundles, so that all 100 bundles he gives to the Am Haaretz belong to him and not the Chaver. Rather, the Chaver must be concerned that his bundle is among the ones he is giving to the Am Haaretz, and he must therefore take off Meiser so as not to be over on giving the payers that were not Me'usarim or Mesukanim to the Am Haaretz. Ad Kan.